Joining us now, our Chief Intelligence Correspondent, Herridge, who's been standing by listening to the news conference along with us as we were mining it for any headlines. And there still seems to be more questions than answers at this time, Catherine. But let's just start bit by bit. What about the question of whether or not this individual had any help? What did you hear in some of the answers that were provided today?
Well, what we've heard at that news conference and what we know through our own reporting here at Fox News is that there's no evidence at this time that there was any assistance in the planning of this attack or that there was outside direction from a terrorist group like ISIS in Iraq and Syria. In fact, all of the evidence, based on what we just heard and our own reporting here at Fox News, points to someone who was self-radicalized by consuming this ideology on the web, either ISIS, but in particular this American cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed by the CIA in a drone strike, but he's really gone on to inspire people to act on behalf of terrorism from the grave. The other thing that jumped out at me from the news conference is that they're trying to pinpoint his actions on the day of the attack, and there's a several-hour gap between the time that he purchased a knife at Walmart, which may have been the knife that he used in the attack, and then the arrival on the campus there. So they're looking to fill in that timeline, but everything at this point points to someone who was inspired, but they're not calling it terrorism at this stage, Jenna.
Talk to us a little bit about the investigation and how it goes from here, Catherine, based on your sources, because I'm sure some of our viewers are listening and saying, wait a minute, okay, we're knowing about this cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki. We've heard about it before.
Right.
We know about the Facebook post. What is there to investigate? Why such reticence from calling it what it seems to be?
Well, I can't speak for the FBI, but that jumped out at me from the news conference as well, saying that it's too soon to call it terrorism. In some cases, it may depend on how you're defining terrorism. Some people see a very high threshold where there's a certain amount of planning and that there's direction from overseas. And then there are those who I would say are in the middle of the spectrum where they become radicalized and they search on the web for the tools they need to launch the attack. So, for example, learning how to make an improvised explosive device. And then there are those who are simply inspired to act because they are consumers of this propaganda. And they do so at very short notice. So there's a broad spectrum. But just look at the facts here. They're saying there's evidence that he was a consumer of this ISIS propaganda in the last 2 weeks. ISIS put out propaganda calling for attacks using vehicles as weapons, also for using knife attacks. And my contacts say they did not think this was a coincidence. They were working on the premise that there was probably a connection. And then also this consumption of propaganda from the American cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. And I can't emphasize to people enough that this is the common thread that you see in almost all of these successful domestic terrorism plots in the United States. And what most people don't realize is that Anwar al-Awlaki was in U.S. custody in 2002 until he was let go with the say-so of an FBI agent. So we had this guy, we let him go, and he went on to become really the godfather of the digital jihad that ISIS has so successfully exploited, and that al-Awlaki to this day, 5 years after his death, he still inspires people with that message of hate, and it looks like that was also the case here, unfortunately, at Ohio State, Jenna.
We certainly want to underscore that point, because Anwar al-Awlaki, again, Al-Qaeda, we're focusing a lot on ISIS, but as we mentioned, the ideologies cross over, and at a certain point, you know, regardless of the name or the title of the group, it is what it is. I only have
it's a witch's brew, basically.
There you go. 45 seconds left, Catherine, but I know the Department of Homeland Security, the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security did make some comments on this today. What can you share with our viewers about that?
Really very consistent with what we heard at the news conference, that everything points to someone who is self-radicalized, inspired by terrorist propaganda, and was not directed to act by a terrorist organization overseas, which, as I said at the beginning, is kind of the highest threshold or standard for a plot inside this country, Jenna.
A lot to watch. Catherine, thank you very much. We
You're
appreciate
welcome.
your expertise, a lot of reporting on that. Something we're